Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at baking our maps. So here we are inside of Maya, and we have our low-res piece of geometry, which is our game res mesh. I'll go ahead and select that, and you can take a look at that. And then we also have our high-res mesh, so I'll select it, hit Shift H to unhide it. And you can see that those models sit directly on top of each other. So it's pretty important to make sure that your models are lined up and that they actually have some correlation to the high res and the low res. So you can see there is differences between these things, but that's what the normal map does. It actually does a calculation and it looks and it tries to either push in or push out from the surface, and it finds wherever that high res surface is, and it builds some color information that gives an indication for where this surface kind of lies in 3D space. So it produces this kind of illusion that there's more kind of detail going on than what there actually is. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the high-res mesh. The other thing I want to talk to you about is in normal circumstances, you would normally take all your edges and soften them all. And I have a version of the Canon. If I hit Shift H on this right here, you can take a look at this one. I'm going to hit Control H to hide this one. And this is what it looks like with all of our edges with the softness turned on. Because we have such a low res mesh, you can see that the shading is really bad along this bottom edge here. It's pretty bad along and through here as well. And what I've found is if we are baking with these really low res meshes like what we have here, you're going to have to go and harden the edges on things because this shading still shows up and through here. And so basically I'm going to take this, I'm going to hide it, Control H, take this one, show it, Shift H. And what I've done is gone through and made sure that I have hard edges on everything that was producing some kind of bad shading in through here. So I went ahead and hardened the edges on all these parts here and here, and especially on like these flaps and this low res part that we have in through here. It was pretty easy to do that. Selected the mesh, and if we go to the modeling section, we can go to mesh display. We can set it at a normal angle, and I set it to something like 30, and that gave me quite a bit of information that was working. I did soften all these edges in through here, but I had to go through and maybe harden up a few different areas like in through here. I think this one kind of held. Don't necessarily need this hard edge in through here, but you know, I could soften that. I could select this with F10, double click that edge, and then shift right click, soften edge like that. So that's one way. That would have been fine for this. I'll hit undo for that. Then once you have your edges kind of set and you're ready to export out, go ahead and select your mesh and then go to File, Export Selection. I'll do the option box, make sure OBJ is the selection type. I'm going to export with everything on except for this materials, don't need a material. So I'll go ahead and say export selection, and then go ahead and navigate to where your items sit and export that out. And you need to do that for the low res Canon and for the high res as well. So let's hop on over to Substance Painter and load that up. So I've got Substance Painter loaded, and this is what you'll see when you first load the program. We're not using any of this kind of startup information. If you don't want to see this window, you can tell it to not display. I'll just go ahead and leave it alone. So I'll close that, and when we start a new scene, we want to go to File, and we'll do New. And you can see this template. There's different shading templates that you want to use. I'll go ahead and use PBR Metal Rough HQ for high quality. I'll go ahead and load that. And normal map format, we're going to leave that in DirectX like that. Document resolution, you can go up all the way to 4096, and I think in new versions it'll go up to over 8000. But for this piece, it's not super large, so we can do 2048 for that. And then you want to select your mesh, your game res mesh. So go to mesh, hit select, then you want to navigate to where your pieces are. So again, I saved out this low res Canon. I saved out two different versions, and I saved out one that has the soft edges. I'll go ahead and load that up first just so I can show you if you do the soft edges, maybe some of the shading problems that you get for that. So I'll go ahead and select that and hit open. And if you baked any maps in any other program like XNormal or something like that, or Substance Designer, you can actually import the maps at the very first part. You can just hit add and open up those maps. We're not doing that. We're going to create the maps directly in here. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. And that should load up a new scene for you. It should show your cannon. Yours might look a little bit different than mine, just because, let's see, if I go to the viewer settings within here, I have my environment opacity turned all the way down, so yours probably looks like this. So within the viewer settings, you can see this environment in here. If you hold down Shift and you right click, you can actually rotate this image-based lighting around, and you can see it updates the lighting on the model itself. So I'm not a big fan of actually seeing this background. If you want to get rid of it completely, you can take the environment opacity, drop it all the way down. You can have it set to 100. I at least like to take this environment blur and blur the background so I don't really kind of pick up any kind of details. I might just get blobs of color, and I kind of like to see it that way. And then hold down Shift right click to kind of drag that thing around. So if you want that background kind of colors, maybe that's something I might suggest for you to do something like that. But if you don't, you can even drop that thing back and get it just to where you want it. So that's kind of more of a personal kind of preference kind of thing. You can also turn on shadows, and if we turn on shadows, there's different ways to calculate the shadows. So there's a lightweight computation, which just means it does it pretty quick, and the quality's not all that great. And you can go all the way up to this intensive computation. That one takes a little bit longer to generate, but it looks better. And it's usually, it doesn't look so great until you let go, and then it kind of resolves the shadow. So it's not like this normal kind of real-time shadow that you would think of in other programs. It's kind of calculating it based off of this IBL, the light in here. You also have a shadow opacity, so if you want to drop that back, you can do that. If you ever want to change your shader types, you can change them directly within here. So you can see I changed this to this clay shader. There's a Dota 2 shader, but you can also get back to your PBR metal rough. Let's see, what's the other one? PBR metal rough with alpha blending, PBR with alpha test. So if you want to do transparency, things like that, you could go ahead and do that. So I'll just put this on PBR metal rough like that and leave it on there. You also have your ambient occlusion intensity. So if you drag that up, that'll make the ambient occlusion a little bit stronger. I don't have any on there currently. And you can also hit these little pencil icons. If you want to make this a perfect number and you type it in with your keyboard, you can go ahead and do that. Here's quality for the visual quality. Depending on your graphics card, you might want to drop it down lower if you're trying to get better performance, but I like to have this on high 64. It does take a little bit longer to kind of draw things, so just be aware that there's a performance thing going on whenever you increase the quality with that. So then let's go to this display settings. So if you go here and you activate this, it's going to activate their this other party is kind of building their in-screen kind of effects. I definitely want to turn on anti-aliasing. That definitely makes things look a bit better. I do like to have a vignette kind of turned on. You can go in within here and you can actually play around with the strength of that. I usually like to have it maybe right around here. And if you want anything that feels like emissive kind of glows, you would have to turn on this glare within through here. This glare works together with, if we go to the viewer settings, there is this emissive intensity, and you might want to drag that up to like 10. I found I had to really crank that up to get anything that kind of resembled what I would see in UE4, and that's my final destination for things. So how to kind of turn that up. And you can also do things like the depth of field if you wanted to kind of play around with that. It's kind of cool. With the depth of field, you have to kind of work with these settings here to kind of get that kind of rolling. But if you want to investigate that, I'll let you kind of take a look at that. Then we've got this area here for texture settings. And Substance uses a thing called texture sets, and that's what it builds to actually build the textures. So if you have a specific material on your model and you want to have it broken up into multiple kind of texture sets or textures, you would have to assign a material. Say if I wanted this part of the cannon to be one material and then this part to be another, I'd assign this another material and give it a name, and then in the base I would assign another material and give it a name, and each one of those would be coming in and they would be separate. So if you export out your maps and everything, it would export out those maps separate. Now what that'll allow you to do is if you wanted 4096 maps on this model, you would have to break it apart in this material, and this material, just like what we talked about. Make it each one of those 4096 within this program, and then that way you're getting higher resolution on each one of these parts. The only drawback is you can't paint across from one thing to the other, so that is a drawback. For our thing, because we're doing something very simple, we've only got one material, and it will be 2048. Now, you can go back through in the program at any point. This is kind of unique to Substance Painter, that if I'm painting in 2048 and I want to bump this up to 4096, all I got to do is come here in the texture set and then put that number higher or lower, and it saves all your brush strokes, so it'll recalculate this. The other thing is if you take your model and you upload it with new UVs, so if you went to edit and go to project configuration, you can come here through mesh and select a new mesh with new UVs. Has to have the same material setup like what we talked about, but if it does that, it'll update the UVs and it'll recalculate all the brush strokes that you have. So that's pretty darn cool. The other thing is we've got in this area channels. So if you want to do anything special, like there's no emissive on here currently, if you want to open up a channel for emissive, you would come to this area, click this, and say emissive. And now that becomes a new slot that we can start to play around with on things. Something else I think is maybe a little bit important to know is this normal map mixing. It's currently set on combine, so it means anything that you make normal map wise in the program in here will combine with what gets baked. If you want to kind of clean up edges and things like that, map baking problems with your normal map, you would change this from combine and you would put it on replace. Now when you do that, you need to give a place within your material, and we'll maybe talk about this a little later, where you would have to hand put in the normal map into the material. So I don't think we really need to mess around with that. So we can actually just leave this on combine. Just keep this in mind that this is the workflow. If you want to do anything kind of cleanup wise, you would not use this combine, you'd use replace. Okay, so you can see now we've got this select normal map, select world, all these different maps that we're going to be baking. You can tell it to select this, but we just don't have anything baked yet in here. So we're going to actually bake these. The place that you bake your maps is this. You see this additional maps, bake textures. If you click that, it opens up this dialog that will allow you to say the baking process, right? So currently we have turned on, we're going to bake a normal map, a world space normal, an ID, which is like a color ID for different parts if you set that up, ambient occlusion, a curvature map, a position map, and a thickness map. So we'll leave all these on. We'll leave this to the output size. We'll do 2048 by 2048. Dilation width is how far out is the pixel bleed past your UVs. So we can do something like at least 8 pixels or something like that for 2048. High definition meshes. So this is where your high res mesh is. So to get that in the program, you just click this button here and you go and you navigate and you find your high res mesh. Hit open like that, and this is populated in here. You can have multiple high res meshes if you want. So this max frontal distance and rear distance is kind of what I was talking about. If you think about the surface, it takes a ray and it projects it either out or in, and it searches for that high-res mesh, and if that ray hits that high-res mesh, it bakes the color information for the normal map and the AO and things like that, right? So these distances are basically how far out will it go into the world to search. And if you have it too high, you'll notice it gets things like if you had something up here, it might actually go up and grab something from some area that you don't need. So if you ever see kind of weird stuff where maybe like the bottom of the cannon is picking up this part here, the distances are probably too high, but we'll leave it at the default, and I think that'll work pretty well. Anti-aliasing, let's go ahead and set that maybe to subsample 2 by 2. So this increases quality, but it increases time for baking. So I think we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and say bake default material textures, and it'll go through and it'll start the baking process. And this goes pretty quick. So again, it's baking all those different maps. It's baking a normal map, world space, ID map, ambient occlusion, and everything else. So as soon as it gets done with this, you might start to actually see some of the maps get finished and then start to populate within the model itself. So here we are after everything's been baked, and I just want to make sure we got this normal map mixing set to combine. You can see if I had it on replace, it doesn't look like anything baked for the normal map. So make sure that's on combine. And so here's what we've got. We've got our model, and it's been baked out, and it actually now, because we've got an ambient occlusion map, some of those things that we looked at before within the viewer settings, this AO intensity, you can see that actually has some kind of effect now because we have an ambient occlusion map. Now this is what I wanted to kind of pull to your attention. This is the model that I had that has all soft edges on there. And normally that's what I do to bake things. I normally take my game res mesh and everything has all soft edges on the entire thing, and I let all the normal information come from the high res mesh that gets baked down to our normal map that we have here. But in the case of these really low res models, you can see that I'm getting this really weird kind of dark shading along here, and along these edges, and it's just not working. It's not what I want. It's doing okay, I think, for this area and through here, so that's working all right. But we've got this, again, this dark edge along the bottom here, and we got some bad shading going on through here. So I'm going to show you how to load a new model in. Again, that process, like what we talked about, is if you go to edit project configuration and you go to mesh and you go ahead and select, and we're going to change this out to the Canon low res that I saved out that's got those hard edges that I set inside of Maya. And again, this is only something I'm using on these really low resolution meshes where the shading is a problem. Select that, I'll hit open, and it's going to ask you to say okay, and it's going to re-put the model in there. We don't have any paint information, so it's not going to do anything kind of different. Now you can see what's been baked out. It actually matters about those hard edges. So this normal map works together with the model and its hard edges and everything else that's kind of going on with it. So we have to rebake. So we're going to go to bake textures, but this time I don't need all the other things that were baked. I can just bake just the normal map if I want. I could just go ahead and say bake default material textures, but just to make sure everything's kind of synced up. I know I don't need to bake a lot of these things, but I'm just going to turn everything on just to make sure I've got a really nice clean bake, and say bake material definitions again, and it'll go through and it's going to take a little bit of time to bake that, so I'll pause it. Okay, my maps have now been baked, and you can see here is the results that we have here. Everything's looking pretty nice and clean. We don't have any of that kind of dark shading. But what we do have, though, if we get in pretty close to this, is we might get this little seam running down along things. So I'm just going to say this is probably, in my mind, the lesser of two evils. I'll go ahead and take this little bit of edge distortion on the edge versus really big dark shading along the edges there. So the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and just take one of these materials, go to the material slot in here. I'm going to find a material, and I'm going to use a material as one of my base. I'll just choose this iron pure. I'll go ahead and select it and drag it up here, and it'll fill it with a whole new kind of layer here. I don't need this layer that was the default layer anymore, so I can select it and just hit the trash icon right there like that and get rid of it. And we can kind of check out these materials. Now, mine's glaring pretty heavily, and that's because if we go back to the display settings, if we go to glare, we can open that up, and if you want to tone that stuff back, or if you kind of like the effect, you can go ahead and leave it, but we've got some settings within here that you can kind of play around with if you wanted to kind of knock that back a little bit. I'll go ahead and just leave it there like it is, put it back on texture set just so I can keep looking at that. So now it's possible you could just kind of drag these different materials in and you could test them out and kind of see. I definitely want something that is going to be a very maybe high polished kind of metal for the very first metal. Let's try this iron grainy and take a look at this. So I think that works pretty well. So I think any one of these would work pretty good. But I think I might just do the iron pure like this. So I think that one's very reflective. So this will give us a nice base to kind of start working with. And so in the next video, we'll take a look at how we can start building all of our different various texture sets and how we can actually do our different kind of materials and painting and everything else like this. But this will give you enough information to get your models baked, get yourself prepped and ready to do this painting process.